My stepmom abandoned me in the hospital to go on vacation. I called my mom. CPS got involved when my dad tried to make me lie. Karen, my stepmother, disgusts me. She is one of the most annoying, controlling, and disrespectful women I've ever met. Since she married my father, my life has been turned upside down. Mom and Dad divorced 3 years ago. Mom and Dad didn't get along and fought frequently. When they announced their divorce, I wasn't surprised. They had never been a wonderful match from the beginning. They tried to make marriage work, but there was constant conflict, particularly over home obligations. Although my father was legally a stay-at-home parent, he did not love any of the traditional household chores that come with that role. Cooking, cleaning, and even assisting me with my homework were never his top priorities, and he made no secret of his hatred for those activities. Instead, he spent most of his time glued to his phone, attempting to grow an online following. He fancied himself a fitness influencer, often recording workout videos or publishing gym content despite his modest following count. When he wasn't on his phone, he spent a lot of his time and a good chunk of my mother's money on gym memberships, protein supplements, and sports gear. These were his regular activities. He never really fit the stereotype of a typical father. While most parents check their children's schoolwork and ensure that they are keeping up in school, my father's primary focus was always himself. He was preoccupied with his physique and wanted me to always be athletic and muscular as if I were a reflection of his image rather than an individual with my own needs. Following the divorce, both of my parents were granted shared custody, and my time was divided between them. It took me some time to adjust to living in 2 different families. And just as I was becoming settled, my father met Karen. He was smitten from their first date. They began dating officially within days, and after only a few weeks, my father forced me to meet with her. Suddenly, this complete stranger was everywhere, and I was expected to warmly welcome her into our lives. Now if Karen were a great person, I wouldn't have had any problems embracing her, but she isn't. Karen had excessive expectations from the beginning. She expected I would gladly embrace her as my new mother despite the fact that she was a complete downgrade from my biological mother. She continually meddles in my life and appears to take every opportunity to mock me. Regardless of what I do, she finds a way to criticize or control me. For example, she has 2 daughters, and she becomes visibly irritated anytime she believes I'm acting too rough or unrefined, as she likes to put it. She has explicitly stated that I should always wear preppy clothes and keep my hair neatly styled, as if my appearance is any of her business. She also insists that I speak more softly and act more gentlemanly around her precious daughters. It does not stop there. When I have friends around, she always interrupts us, claiming she's just checking in. But it's not just a brief hello or a casual query. She barges in and hovers around as if she doesn't trust me and my friends to be alone. It's really obtrusive and, frankly, humiliating. When I complain or urge her to leave us alone, she dismisses it, stating things like teenage boys require constant supervision around girls, and that we should just pretend she isn't even around. It's irritating that she doesn't interfere as much with her daughters or feel the need to constantly monitor their movements. When I've tried to express how much this worries me to my father, hoping for support or at least some understanding, he just dismisses it. He claims she's just being protective as if it excuses her actions. On top of everything, Karen's 2 daughters make my life even more difficult. They have no idea of personal space, and their personalities contradict mine in every aspect. They are also relentless when it comes to bullying me. They continuously tease, mock, and find new ways to make me feel small. And instead of intervening, my father dismisses their behavior, stating, "That's how all siblings bond." When my father decided to marry Karen after only a year of dating, he expected me to simply fall in line. He made it clear that he loved Karen and was determined to make their marriage work. He knew I had reservations and frustrations, but he was clear about what he expected from me to give Karen a chance without making things difficult for him. He begged me to welcome her as a member of our family. It seemed like a lot to ask, especially considering how quickly everything was occurring. But I wanted to assist him while keeping the peace, so I agreed to try. Since then, I have made a genuine attempt to accept Karen and her daughters. I've tried to follow her routines and adapt to the changes, though it hasn't been easy. One of the things that upsets me the most is Karen's insistence that I refer to her as Mom. It doesn't feel right, and every time I say it, I can't help but feel animosity rise within me. I already have a mother, and I do not want to replace her. However, Karen does not seem to realize or care that it is difficult for me. Beyond the name, what is truly upsetting is my father's shift in focus and goals. After his marriage, he seemed to be more concerned with Karen's daughters than with me. He spends more time with them, assists them in ways he never did for me, and treats them more like a father than he ever did for me. I sometimes feel as though I've lost my place in his life. He is simply a father to Karen's daughters now. I'd want to live with my mother, especially because she's normally more understanding. However, she had to relocate for a new job in another city, which paid her substantially more. She pays me occasional visits, but I live with my father full-time. Mom and I also communicate on the phone frequently. She is aware of some of my concerns with Karen and her daughters since I have discussed them with her. She's really supportive and has even attempted to talk to my father about the matter. I believe she sincerely wants to assist, but whenever she brings it up, my father shuts her off. He tells her to back off and says she shouldn't meddle with his marriage. Despite everything, I've worked hard over the years to acclimate to life with my new family. I've really tried to make an effort with Karen and her daughters, believing that if I remain patient and transparent, we could develop a nice relationship. Despite my best attempts, I continue to feel invisible within my own family. This year, Karen was suddenly promoted at work. When she got home, she excitedly declared that she'd be taking us all on a family trip. We were all excited by the news, especially since we hadn't been on a vacation together in a long time. She and Dad chose the location and reserved tickets and lodgings for all of us. Unfortunately, just a day before our trip, I was involved in a car accident with my father. We were heading home from shopping for some clothing for our impending vacation when another automobile smashed into us from behind. It wasn't a major collision, but it was enough to throw us off course and cause some injuries. My father was generally fine with a few scrapes and bruises here and there, but I wasn't that fortunate. The accident caused me to break my arm and suffer a concussion. The ambulance arrived, and I was quickly brought to the hospital. When Karen initially learned of our accident, she rushed to the hospital, appearing concerned. At first, I assumed she was really concerned for my and my father's well-being, and that she had come to see us. But then she kept bringing up the trip, agonizing about whether we'd still be able to travel and worried that the money she'd invested would be wasted. The physicians eventually advised us that due to my concussion, I would need to spend a few days in the hospital for observation. They wanted to make sure I was okay before allowing me to return home, but travel was obviously out of the question for me. Karen glanced at me, irritated, as if I was to blame for getting into the accident and wasting her money. My father half-heartedly offered to remain with me while I was in the hospital. It gave me hope that he would choose to help me during such a tough moment. Karen, on the other hand, was quick to respond, stating that because our plane tickets had already been purchased, we were already losing money by not going. She argued that my father should not waste even more money by staying behind. She then turned to me and said that at my age, I should be able to stay in the hospital alone for a few days. She mentioned how safe the hospital was with physicians and nurses available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, hinting that I had nothing to worry about. Karen then insisted that once I was discharged, she would arrange for a babysitter to stay with me at home. I argued with Karen that I didn't want to be alone in the hospital or have a babysitter look after me at home. I urged my father to stay with me instead. At first, my father tried to defend me, telling Karen that it wasn't proper to leave me alone in the hospital. He knew it was wrong. Karen, however, continued to push back. She insisted that my father's presence was unneeded and that his staying would mean sitting by my side doing nothing meaningful all day. She made it appear as if his presence was pointless, entirely neglecting the emotional support he could truly offer. Karen prioritized avoiding spending her vacation money over anything else. It was evident that she didn't consider me to be her biological child, thus she didn't care how I felt or what had happened to me. I pleaded that at 15 years old, I shouldn't be left alone in the hospital. I was terrified and in agony, and the prospect of going through this without any family members around was overwhelming. I proposed a solution, stating that Dad could contact my mother to come and stay with me while he and Karen went on their trip. Sure. It would take her some time to get here because she lived in another city, but I was confident she'd come right away if she realized I was in the hospital. I figured this would allow them to continue their vacation while keeping me company. But Karen rejected the notion almost immediately. She ignored my concerns, calling me foolish for making such a huge deal about small injuries. She dismissed my notion of calling my mother, arguing that it would just make her worry more. Karen felt there was no need to interrupt anybody else's plans over something as minor as a concussion and a fractured arm, which she believed would mend well with a few days of hospital rest. In the end, Karen's pressure was effective. I stared at my father, hoping he would hold his ground and insist on staying with me. But as usual, he caved to Karen. Instead of battling for what I needed, he decided to go. He only stayed with me for one night, which provided some consolation. I clung to the hope that after seeing how vulnerable I was, he would realize I needed his presence. But the next day, Karen arrived at the hospital to bring him up, anxious to embark on the vacation as planned, without regard for how I was doing. I felt abandoned and deceived when my father left me alone in the hospital. After only one day alone, I couldn't stop crying. One of the nurses saw me crying. When she realized I didn't have anyone nearby to check on me, she offered to phone my father. I told her it was all right, that they would probably not respond, but she insisted. So I gave her my mother's number instead. I partly expected my mother to chastise me or, like Karen, tell me that I was exaggerating and that being alone in the hospital was no big issue. But when my mother answered the phone and the nurse told her about my position, she was immediately alarmed. She sounded more concerned than I had heard Mom in a long time and inquired whether my father had truly gone on the vacation without me. I described everything, including how Karen insisted on leaving me behind because she didn't want the trip money to go to waste, and how my father eventually consented. My mother was outraged. As I told her everything, she became silent. But I could sense her rage simmering. She then told me that my father had just indicated that we had been in a little fender bender, downplaying the entire incident. He hadn't mentioned my fractured arm, concussion, or the fact that he and Karen had left me alone in the hospital. According to what he told her, there was nothing to worry about, therefore, she didn't feel the need to contact me. Hearing that my father had willfully lied about my circumstances to my mother made me feel even more hurt and betrayed. My mother instantly told me that she will come over as soon as possible. She said she'd drop everything, drive to the hospital, and remain with me for as long as it took. For the first time since my admission, I felt relief knowing that my mother was on her way to be with me and that someone was finally taking my conditions seriously. As I sat there waiting, I realized how much I needed this type of support in my life. Within 2 hours, my mother arrived at the hospital. Seeing her enter through the door felt like a great weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I started crying as she hugged me and promised me that everything will be fine. She then went straight to my doctors, making sure she grasped every aspect of my injuries. I could see relief on her face as she affirmed that while my injuries were severe and significant, they were not life-threatening. She genuinely regretted not being there for me sooner and not challenging my father's version of events. She told me she regretted assuming that everything was good without personally checking in on me, and it was evident she was beating herself up over it. My mother was visibly angry at Karen. She was upset that my stepmother had the audacity to dismiss my demands and then choose to go on a trip rather than ensure my well-being. Karen's lack of respect and concern by leaving me alone in the hospital demonstrated how little I meant to her. Her behavior screamed volumes, indicating that despite being married to my father, I was nothing more than an annoyance to her. My mother tried contacting my father and Karen, but neither answered. This infuriated Mom even more, and she vowed that she would give Karen and Dad a lesson for abandoning me like this. Over the next 2 nights, my mother stayed by my side, having taken time from work to ensure that I was not alone. She never left me alone till I was released. Even then, she wasn't keen about me returning to Karen's place where I'd be left with only a babysitter until everyone returned. Instead, she insisted I accompany her home, and I consented. Once I arrived at my mother's house, she attempted to contact Dad again. He claimed to have missed her previous calls since he was having so much fun with Karen and her daughters. Hearing this inflamed her rage even more, and she did not hold back. She forcefully told him that his actions were unacceptable, that abandoning me in the hospital was a major act of neglect, and that she intended to take legal action to hold him and Karen responsible. She even mentioned taking him to court if necessary, which implies he could lose custody of me. She made it apparent that she was ready to report him and Karen for their activities. Since then, my phone has been constantly vibrating with calls and texts from both Karen and my father. Instead of accepting their actions or apologizing, they've been sending messages accusing me of ruining their vacation by informing my mother about my position. Karen has even gone so far as to claim that all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and silently remain in the hospital without causing a scene. They said everything would have been okay if I had just complied. I was made to feel bad about throwing my dad and stepmom under the bus. Update 1. For everyone who is asking, now that I've had some time to think about it and spoken with my mother, I know how many times Karen and Dad have neglected me over the years, and I've just let it happen. I remained silent, thinking things would change, but they never did. It's difficult to accept, yet I let myself be pushed aside for their convenience. Now thinking back, I can't believe I put up with it for so long. For example, Karen frequently strained my relationship with my mother. She would continually make disparaging comments about her, calling her a deadbeat or a loser in comparison to her. Karen believed my mother was not a good spouse to my father, and as a result, she felt she had the right to criticize her whenever she wanted. Dad never asked her to stop. When I experienced problems at home or tried to talk to my father about them, Karen always rejected my concerns. She would tell me that I was exaggerating things or that I was overly sensitive because I was a boy. She often said that this was why she was so fortunate to have only girls. Karen consistently demonstrated preference for her daughters even in minor everyday exchanges. She was always willing to help them with their bills. But if I asked my father for anything, Karen would probe me with endless questions. She often accused me of buying useless items and wasting money, even though it wasn't her money. It was my mother's money. Therefore, I should have had the freedom to spend it any way I chose. Despite living in the same house, we never had quality time together as a family. Karen and Dad would frequently make plans with their daughters and exclude me, claiming they didn't want to bother me or wanted to spend quality time together without me. This often made me feel abandoned and unimportant. They'd go out to dinner or do activities they enjoyed without thinking about whether I'd want to join. This is perhaps why I was so delighted to accompany them on their vacation. They rarely engage me in their plans. Karen and Dad also do not like to celebrate my birthdays. They usually tell me that since Karen's daughters don't make a big fuss about their birthdays, I shouldn't expect much either. It's as if they assume I don't deserve particular attention simply because it's not their style. When it comes to gifts, I constantly wind up with stuff I don't like or utilize as if they didn't think about what I genuinely appreciate. Whenever I was failing in school, Karen would say stuff like, "You're just lazy. That's your problem. And why do you even bother with that stuff?" Instead of asking what was wrong or providing assistance, she complained about how it inconvenienced her. Dad, on the other hand, would remain mute, offering no words of comfort or support despite knowing how badly it affected me. Update 2. So my mother did report Dad and Karen to CPS. She didn't make this decision lightly, but she felt it was vital to ensure that what had occurred was not forgotten. She couldn't just sit back and let them treat me that way, abandoning me in the hospital with no second thought. When Karen and my father came home, they were called by CPS. They had to answer numerous questions about the situation, their behavior, and their decision to leave me. I'm sure it was a wake-up call for them, one they probably didn't expect. But the authorities agreed with my mother. Leaving me behind in the hospital, especially after being injured, was unacceptable. They admitted that I had been ignored in a way that jeopardized my well-being. Later, my father called me. He wasn't happy, and his tone indicated that he was furious with me. He told me that by involving CPS, I had gotten both him and Karen in a lot of trouble. He seemed to be blaming me for what had happened, although I knew I had done nothing wrong. He cautioned me that CPS would be contacting me next to hear my side of the story. My father then forcefully pressured me to lie to the authorities, warning me that if I didn't, I'd be taken away from him and he'd lose custody. I disagreed with him, telling him that I wasn't comfortable lying to the authorities and that he should have considered the repercussions of his actions before abandoning me at the hospital that day. Dad then tried to guilt-trip me, telling me that he had given me years of his life and that I needed to prove my loyalty to him this time. He made it sound like I was betraying him by being open with the authorities, as if I was to blame for everything that transpired. But what really struck me was his statement that lying would protect Karen and her daughters. He emphasized how the CPS investigation could generate complications for Karen, particularly with her ex-husband. He warned that Karen's ex might find out and use this as leverage to make Karen pay for it. I just shook my head, realizing that my father was more worried with Karen's reputation and her own than with what I had gone through. He never inquired about my health or recovery. Meanwhile, he begged me to lie and protect his family. I couldn't stand his selfishness any longer. I kept my position and told him unequivocally that I didn't care how this affected him or Karen. I would not lie to the authorities. I informed him that I would tell them everything that happened and that I would not be covering up anything for anyone. If this meant he and Karen were in trouble, then so be it. They were the adults here. They were the ones who made mistakes, so I was not going to shield them from the consequences of their actions. My father raged at me, calling me names, but I refused to give in. Update 3. It has been about 2 weeks since my previous update. I spoke to the authorities and told them the truth. For the time being, I plan to stay with my mother. My mother has been looking at school so I can live with her permanently. I must admit that living with her feels good. Dad has continued to try to guilt-trip me, but there is nothing further he can do at this time. He has received a warning from CPS. Dad had clearly abandoned his obligation to me, and this could not be overlooked. CPS has urged my father to make significant adjustments, including required parenting classes and counseling to address his neglect issues and his connection with me. Karen was also questioned since she had demonstrated a lack of respect and concern for me, particularly following the hospital episode. CPS made it plain that they would closely watch the issue if and when I came over to stay with them. They warned that any more negligence or cruelty would result in more severe punishment. 4 months later, I can't believe it's been nearly 4 months since I lived with Mom. I feel like I'm finally in a place where I don't have to walk on eggshells or question my worth. Living with Mom has been a tremendous relief. She is encouraging, listens to me, and most importantly, respects my space and decisions. It's been a full 180 degrees from what I was dealing with previously. I feel heard here. I can tell her about my day, my troubles, my dreams, and she actually cares. I've been able to devote more time to my studies and mental health, and I believe I'm finally returning to my true self. I've also made some wonderful new friends at school, and I truly like spending time with them. In fact, last month, for the first time in a long time, I was able to celebrate my birthday properly. I invited all of my friends over, and we ate pizza while watching action movies. It was the kind of birthday I'd always wanted but never got while living with my father and Karen. Dad's situation remains complex. He's been attempting to contact me more regularly recently, even texting me about how sorry he is and how much he misses me. Part of me feels bad for staying away, but then I recall everything that led me to this point. I made it apparent to him that I'm still not ready to return. And while he attempts to reach out, I have set boundaries for myself. His acts were detrimental, and he must accept full responsibility for them. As for Karen, she has neither apologized or taken responsibility for her conduct. Honestly, I am not surprised. She has never demonstrated genuine concern for me or my well-being. I will never forget how she treated me, especially in the hospital. I don't care whether she ever changes. I'm not waiting to find out. I've learned to rely on myself and those that genuinely care for me. And that's it. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.